All right, friends, we'll bring it around. We'll have more chances to chat soon, I promise. All right, so we're going to start this morning with something a little bit different than we often do at the beginning of this part of the morning. I'm going to start with just a little question to reflect on, a little personal moment of reflection. And the question for you to sit with, just think about for a moment, is what is it that helps you feel safe and secure? What is it that helps you feel safe and secure? Whatever's coming to mind, think a little bit about how those things, that thing, whatever it is, contributes to your sense of security. How does that happen for you? And now I invite you to think a little bit and maybe try to tap into how that sense of security and safety feels in your body. Like when you're aware of that coming online, where do you feel that? Just take a moment and let you feel that. And now before we go on, I invite you to turn to a neighbor and maybe one or two, whatever works, and just maybe share what it was that came to mind for you. And listen, we'll just take a minute. It'll be quick. Just go ahead and share with somebody nearby you what helps you feel safe and secure. All right, we're going to bring it back. So this is our third teaching this week in a series we've been doing this fall that I'm calling Adulting in Faith, where we're considering together what does it mean to kind of like grow up a bit in our spirituality? How might that impact how we live, how we connect with one another, how we connect with the divine? So today, we're tackling a topic that I think most of us, whether we would like to acknowledge it or not, has been a core part of the adulting reality, considering how we manage our material resources. In other words, our money, our stuff. Okay, for many of us, I'm guessing it was something related to managing our money that first drove home that we had, in fact, entered adulthood, right? Whether it was getting that first job, having to pay rent, writing that first check to the utility company and coming to learn how much things like water and electricity actually cost, right? All of that's part of the process of becoming a fully fledged adult. So fun. So learning to manage money is clearly a core part of maturing or adulting in life. It's also connected often to some of our sense of security that we were reflecting on earlier. But how does Jesus-centered faith impact how we're thinking about managing our resources? How might a maturing spirituality shape that process of adulting? Well, before we get into those questions a bit more, I just want to acknowledge from the outset the challenges and potential triggers that a conversation like this can bring up. So if anyone's feeling a little anxious, I get it, okay? Particularly in a church context, there can be some anxiety. Let's be honest. Haven exists in many ways as a refuge for folks who haven't always been able to find acceptance and safety in other spiritual community spaces. Many of us have actually experienced harm, even trauma in churches in the past, and sometimes that trauma has been connected, at least in part, to the way that those churches have dealt with conversations around money and faith. Some of us have likely been in faith-based spaces where we may have felt ourselves manipulated, even coerced in unhealthy ways into giving a significant percentage of our resources to the church. I just want to name that up front. Name that I am sensitive to that. This call to giving may have been pitched as some kind of spiritual investment strategy, like akin to something around prosperity gospel faith. Perhaps we were promised if we put in a certain number of dollars into a church, God would in turn give out money, blessing us to become more wealthy. Some people have heard that. Or maybe we found ourselves in spaces that kind of emphasized personal piety through a pretty perfectionistic kind of lens. So we were coached to maybe kind of perceive of God like this divine accountant, tracking every cent that we gave away. And if at our final financial cosmic audit, God found we hadn't given a minimum of 10% of all of our earnings, we would be judged disappointing, sinful, maybe even deserving of some sort of punishment. So my awareness of the baggage that folks in this community may have around resources and spirituality has often meant that I've generally opted not to talk about it at all because I didn't want to trigger or re-traumatize folks. But in recent months, I've been forced myself to reflect on how that's not particularly healthy or adult of me as a leader either. And its impact has downstream effects. As some of you know, the last couple years have been financially challenging for our little motley crew. We lost some significant donors. That's left a mark. At present, our Haven board, I'm just being adult with you, is currently projecting a loss of over $20,000 this year. And that's even with me working only half-time over the summer. So while we have the savings to take that loss this year, we can't do that indefinitely. Something at some point will have to shift, or Haven will need to make more fundamental changes. So aside from just that practical reality, it's also real that Jesus himself actually talked about money a lot. To avoid the topic is actually not to be very mature in faith, right? But it's to miss out on something that Jesus thought was pretty important in terms of following him. It was clear that Jesus believed that trusting the divine with our resources was pretty fundamental to growing in faith. So today, we're wading in. I'm hoping we can have a trauma-informed, spiritually adult conversation that recognizes both the wounds that we may carry around our topics around our material resources, but also the invitations from Jesus to mature in how we handle our resources, both individually and collectively. And as always, this should always be true, but I'm going to remind us, I encourage you to tend to your needs as the conversation takes place. Feel free to take some deep breaths. Step outside if you need to. If anything is activating you in ways that you find you are shutting down rather than opening up to what Jesus may have for you. Take care of yourself. My hope, though, is that through this exploration, in the context of, I would hope, a relatively safe space here in our Haven community, we might participate together in redeeming this area for our community, for each of us individually as well as together, so that all of us can come to have a more life-giving relationship with thinking about how we manage what we've been entrusted with. All right? So today we're going to look at a story from the life of Jesus that's found in the Gospel of Luke. It's a bit of a longer passage. I'm just forewarning you. We're going to look at all the passage together, but then we'll kind of focus in on a core part of it. So leading up to our passage, Jesus has been preaching to an extremely large crowd, a growing number of people. Luke tells us they're now in the thousands. And we pick things up with him in Luke 12, verse 13. Someone in the crowd said to him, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the family inheritance with me." But he said to him, "Friend, who sent me to be a judge or arbitrator over you?" And then he said to them, "Take care. Be on your guard against all kinds of greed, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of possessions." And then he told them a parable. The land of a rich man produced abundantly. And he thought to himself, "What should I do? For I have no place to store my crops." And then he said, "I will do this. I will pull down my barns and build larger ones. And there I will store all my grain and my goods. And I will say to my soul, 'Ha, soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, be merry.' But God said to him, 'You fool. This very night your life is being demanded of you. And the things you have prepared, whose will they be?' So it is with those who store up treasures for themselves, but are not rich towards God." And then he said to his disciples, "Therefore I tell you, do not worry about your life, what you will eat, about your body, what you will wear. For life is more than food, the body more than clothing. Consider the ravens. They neither sow nor reap. They have neither storehouse nor barn, and yet God feeds them. Of how much more value are you than the birds? And which of you by worrying can add a single hour to your span of life? And if then you are not able to do so small a thing as that, why do you worry about the rest? Consider the lilies, how they grow. They neither toil nor spin, yet I tell you, even Solomon in all his glory was not clothed like one of these. But if God so clothes the grass of the field, which is alive today, tomorrow is just thrown into the oven, how much more will God clothe you, you of little faith? And do not keep seeking what you are to eat, what you are to drink. Do not keep worrying. For it is the nations of the world that seek all these things, and your Father knows you need them. But instead seek God's kingdom, and these things will be given to you as well. So do not be afraid, little flock. It is your Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom. Sell your possessions, give alms, make purses for yourself that do not wear out, an unfailing treasure in heaven where no thief comes near and no moth destroys. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." Okay, so we have this longer teachable moment, right, of Jesus regarding resources. But it all starts how? With this request made to him, right? It begins with a bit of family drama regarding an inheritance. We start with a fairly common experience of sibling rivalry. There's a dispute about who gets what from the estate that a couple of brothers seem to have inherited from their parents. And rather than work it out lovingly, collaboratively between them, they're fighting. One of them, probably the younger brother, calls upon this celebrity itinerant preacher passing through town for support. "Tell my brother, divide the inheritance with me," he pleads. And Jesus isn't interested in weighing in on the particulars of this family drama, but he is interested in highlighting the deeper heart concern that he senses is leading this man to get so worked up about this issue in the first place. "Watch out," he responds. "Be on your guard against all kinds of greed because one's life does not consist in the abundance of possessions." Jesus here is highlighting this deeper philosophical question that's underlying the whole passage, right? What is life ultimately about? What does bring our life meaning and value and security? Jesus believes this brother is mistaken in putting his value in the material possession, so what's he missing? And to speak to this, Jesus tells a parable. It's a fairly straightforward story. Rich farmer has a windfall crop, a crop that more than exceeds his capacity to even store it. So his solution, build bigger storage facilities. Now, at first glance, that might seem wise, prudent thing to do. The guy wants to save his resources, not to just squander them. I mean, isn't that a good thing? In capitalism, we would certainly say yes, right? But God actually calls this man foolish. It turns out he's saving for a rainy day he's never going to see. This is actually his last day on earth. And what legacy is he leaving behind? An overflowing barn. That's it. So where did things get off track for this guy? Well, I think the story holds a couple of clues. First, notice that there are only two characters in this little parable, right? There's the rich landowner and there's God. No one else is mentioned. I mean, presumably there must be other people in this person's world. There must be workers on his farm, if nothing else. Are we really to believe he is going to both harvest this bumper crop and then tear down all those barns and build all new ones all by himself? Of course not. What about his friends, family, other kin? I mean, even if this guy never married, doesn't he have any relations? No siblings he's supposed to be sharing the inheritance of land that he's working with? No nieces, no nephews, no elders to care for? If those people exist, they don't seem to enter his mind. They're not in his area of concern. Look at his dialogue. It's completely self-oriented. You can see it with the bolds. All these repetitions of I and my. What should I do? I have no place to store my crops. I will do this, and so on, and so on, and so on. This man's focus is super narrow. No one else is even in view. He experiences this unexpected blessing, which Jesus makes clear comes not from himself, but just from the abundance of the land. But upon receiving this abundance, his focus is exclusively on himself and his own sense of personal security. At a core level, it's clear this dude is anxious. Okay, you can see that in the relief that he seems to feel when he starts talking about reassuring his own soul, right? He's like, oh, soul, I'm going to talk to you, right? This innermost part of his being has clearly been really worried. And now he thinks, okay, with the overflowing barns from this bumper crop, soul, you can finally chill out, right? You can relax. Maybe for the first time, actually enjoy life a little. But will he? I mean, it's not like the guy was poor before. Jesus named at the beginning. He started the story as a rich man. He already had likely more than he needed to more than cover his basic necessities. He certainly could have been taking vacations if he wanted to, right? Yet it was never enough to calm that gnawing sense of insecurity within. The guy thinks now it's enough. Now he can feel secure. But we all know how this goes. This kind of satisfaction is very fleeting. I think about when my kids were little. This time of year, October, would usually be the beginning of the pre-Christmas fervor. Some toy in some store would catch their eye, and they would just become hyper fixated on Christmas morning, right? And letters to Santa, Christmas lists, hints strategically dropped to any grown-up who'd listen, which, by the way, just happened for my 15-year-old. P.S. So apparently we haven't outgrown it. Anyway, all of these things are happening. And it's clear this kid believes if only they could find this amazing treasure under the tree, they will be so happy. Christmas will be perfect. And of course, as a parent, it's a joy when you can put that treasured item under the tree and you can see their face and they whoop and they scream with delight when they unwrap it. It's less of a joy when a few months later you find that once coveted item just has joined the pile under the bed of other discarded toys, while your kid is now captivated by some other object, right? And so our rich farmer feels that kind of Christmas morning relief for a bit, convinced he has the thing he's been longing for, but it's an illusion. And as God points out, it's a foolish one, because as much as this man has been trying to make himself feel safe and secure, believing that overflowing barns, that's what's going to do that, he's actually not in control of very much. He's actually powerless to prevent his own demise. And in the face of that, all of his anxious striving has actually been totally futile. And that brings me to the heart of what I think Jesus was trying to reveal with this parable and all the discourse that comes around it. And it's kind of I'm going to say this in two parts, but they're connected. Relying on our material resources for our personal sense of security actually makes us vulnerable. Okay, I'm going to say that again. That's the first part. Take it in. Relying on our material resources for our personal sense of security actually makes us vulnerable. How? Because it isolates us from God and from others. And it keeps us from experiencing the collective joy, beauty, and safety that solidarity and interdependence bring. You hear me? I'll repeat that last part again. When we are relying on our personal sense of security from our resources, we can get isolated from God, isolated from other people, and that keeps us from experiencing the actual collective joy, beauty, and safety that solidarity and interdependence can bring. So the story ends with God's admonition that when people like this landowner, they are foolish because they store up lots of things for themselves, but they're not what he calls rich towards God. So what does he mean by that, to be rich towards God? Well, I think Jesus is speaking to our choice to invest in relationships, in community, in people. I mean, that goes back to our most ancient origin stories. God, the one who made people in their image, saying people should be in relationships. Back in the garden, it's not good for the human to be alone. God, who within God's own self is a relationship of loving collaboration, Father, Son, Spirit, all working together. So to become rich in God is to be richly invested in community. This is why Jesus says later in the passage, you can sell your possessions, you can give some away, you don't need to keep it all. Don't worry, God will make sure you don't starve or go thirsty, but you can let go from holding the responsibility, all of it, of your own security. The stuff is meant to share. It's meant to build community with. That's how we build heavenly treasure instead of earthly treasure, by valuing people over profits. Jesus and his followers clearly embodied this. They lived itinerantly, they traveled lightly, they kept little property to themselves, they accepted the hospitality and support of all who felt called to give it to them, to feed them, to welcome them into their homes. And Jesus regularly called upon people to offer that kind of hospitality if they had the means, with the resources that had been entrusted to them. So just 2 chapters later, in Luke, Jesus is dining in the home of a religious leader with, a crew of his peers. So we're thinking relatively privileged, middle class kind of resourced folks listening in on their conversation. And Jesus said to the one who had invited him, when you give a luncheon or a dinner, do not invite your friends or your brothers and sisters or your relatives or your rich neighbors in case they may invite you in return and you would be repaid. But when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, and you will be blessed because they cannot repay you, for you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous. So here Jesus is speaking to people who are not completely isolated. These people at least host people, right? But their social relations are ultimately kind of self-serving. They're all reciprocal, right? I have you over for dinner, so you'll have me over for dinner, and we're even. But though this may be an improvement from total isolation, it's still not living into interdependence and solidarity and ultimately trust of the divine for our care. Over and over again, Jesus is inviting anyone who will listen to divest from the economy of self-sufficiency and reciprocity and invest in an alternative kind of economy, one marked by countercultural generosity, kinship, and care. In other words, the economy of the kingdom of God. Now, last weekend, I had the opportunity to be a part of an experience that felt a little bit like I was experiencing some of that divine kingdom and the power of being invested in it. As some of you know, I joined this immigrant detention center pilgrimage. We've got a whole bunch of pictures here, sponsored by Interfaith Movement for Human Integrity. And so with this group, I demonstrated in front of 2 different detention centers. There was the Mesa Verde Center in Bakersfield and the newly opened center at a former prison in California City in the middle of the Mojave Desert. We were there to draw attention to the inhumane conditions of these centers and to bring care and encouragement to our siblings who are trapped inside. In addition to our demonstrations, we spent time connecting with people who had come throughout the state, through a series of events, meals together. We heard from attorneys tirelessly fighting uphill battles, from community organizers and activists on the ground in the Central Valley doing the work to try to dismantle these injustices. We heard from immigrants who have spent years of their life in these torturous places. We wept with family members who just longed to hug their loved ones and bring them home. We grieved precious lives that have been lost in these facilities. But the sense of solidarity was most palpable when we took to the streets together. The organizers were so thoughtful as they prepared us for how we were going to engage with law enforcement should we encounter resistance from ICE. So all of us at times were instructed that we were all going to wear masks to cover our faces together, so that those of us, those courageous folks among us who had attended knowing that they were in fact in danger of being taken and detained, that they would not be the only ones who had to hide their identity, right? If they have to keep their masks on, we're all keeping our mask on, right? We're not going to let them separate us. In a similar way, we were coached that if we were approached by ICE and asked to show proof of our legal status, we should not speak to them. We should not try to bring out our driver's license. In fact, all of us would hold up a red card, which asserts our right to remain silent. All of us would do this together, so we couldn't be divided, and some of us become more vulnerable to detention. We agreed to these embodied experiences of solidarity with the chant that has actually become a staple of activist spaces, at least since the major Black Lives Matter actions in 2020. Who keeps us safe? We keep us safe. We would say again and again. Who keeps us safe? We keep us safe. These activists, I believe, are chanting a truth that I think Jesus was trying to teach his followers over 2 millennia ago. All of us are sacred. All of us are created in the divine image. All of us are part of the same family and cared for by the same divine parent. And so, our true security comes from our belonging in the family of God. And our resources bring life when they can support this sacred community so that we can keep us safe. It's not that our material resources themselves are a problem. Jesus relied on the generous extension of these kinds of resources, but our funds can only bring the security we need when they are useful in building relationships and sacred community. Because ultimately, when the going gets tough, it's the people we're connected to that are going to bring us a more enduring security than any of our material possessions could. Amen? Friends, I know a lot of us are scared right now. In this political moment, we're rightly scared. People are being snatched off the streets. That is happening. People are being targeted for violence. Like we talked about a couple weeks ago, we're right to be scared, but when we're scared, I think it can be tempting, especially for those of us who are relatively privileged, especially for those of us who are white. It can be tempting to hunker down, build our own little bunkers of security, focus on how I can take care of me and mine and ride it out. And while I certainly understand that temptation, I believe Jesus-centered faith calls us to resist it. Because when we hunker down, it's the folks among us who are most likely to be harmed that are abandoned and made more vulnerable. And we ourselves in our little bunkers are isolated. In times of trouble, that's when we need more than ever to invest in building robust networks and communities because we keep us safe. So practically, what does this kind of adulting in faith look like? How can we trust God more fully with our resources and contribute some of them to building sacred community? Well, I just want to be clear. I don't think there's only one appropriate answer to that question. I think probably all of us are called to do this in multiple ways, in multiple sets of relationships and networks that we're connected to. So I'm just going to end with 3 examples from my own life that are pretty recent. So I think about the block party that my neighborhood threw yesterday. A handful of us took on several organizing tasks. We secured permits, we put up some flyers, we rented a bouncy house, we hired a DJ, we made some dishes, we brought some tables and chairs into the street. Would anyone else come, though? That was the question. As one of the primary organizers, I admit I wondered if all our costs would be covered, if there would be enough food, and so on. Turns out I didn't need to fear. Folks heard the music, the laughter of the kids on the bouncy house, and they just came out of their houses. They wanted to be there. Food and drinks just kept appearing and appearing until we had to give surplus away at the end. The permit's over, we have to reopen the street, take the food, please. Venmo contributions just kept flowing throughout the week and organically totally covered all the costs. Around 100 people, many of whom had never met but have lived within feet of each other for years, showed up and smiled and chatted and shared a beverage, learned each other's names. And it was such a beautiful example of collaboration building solidarity. Another manifestation I've seen of this recently has been happening on the sidewalk outside of the administrative ICE building in downtown San Francisco with this same organization, Interfaith Movement for Human Integrity. I've been leading some regular court vigils there on behalf of the organization. So basically we gather outside of the court, we give away snacks and coffee and water, we sing songs, we offer blessings to all of the immigrants who are waiting to go inside and have their ICE check-in or their court hearing, and they're obviously scared, understandably so. Now, there's no central fund like buying all these snacks and coffee. There's just a lot of volunteers who are taking turns grabbing a couple of extra items at the grocery store to share with our neighbors in line. And the folks there are always so grateful for just the small, here's a cookie, here's some crackers, the small gift of hospitality, and somehow there's always enough in the bag. Finally, investment in sacred community certainly also looks like investment in building and sustaining organizations like our beautiful little Haven, right? I believe what we're doing here shouldn't be that different from that community potluck I just told you about, right? Everyone bringing what they have. We're giving trustingly and open-handedly out of what we've received and finding somehow that when more and more people bring what they're able to bring, it's altogether enough. It's interdependent, it's connected, it's practiced corporate solidarity. Now, we have folks in this community who have quietly been giving very generously to this Haven project for years. We wouldn't exist as a community without them. They've been investing in this project because they believe that God has invited them to trust God with their resources, to give generously to God's work here. And they show up faithfully as like co-hosts to this little party we're throwing each time we gather. And I believe and hope they are doing so, feeling a sense of satisfaction, knowing that their contribution makes a real difference, even if they're the only ones who are doing so. But what if they weren't? What if all of us who call Haven home acknowledge the gift of what they've given and said, you know what? I may not even know who you are. I don't need to know. I just appreciate that people have been taking the lead on that. And I also recognize we're building collective solidarity, which means I can be a part of it too. I can move from attending this great party to maybe helping host it, bringing my dish to the table. I might not be able to give the same that somebody else gives, but I too can let go just a little bit. I can divest from some part of my own personal security to invest in what's happening here. How powerful for our whole collective might that be? It's with that question in mind, I'm just going to end by introducing, in an open-handed, totally invitational way, a new kind of campaign that our Haven leadership is launching this month. We're calling it Haven Partners. Now, we're not a church that has formal membership. We've always been a very come-as-you-are crew, get involved as you feel called. But I do think there's also something powerful about making commitments to things that we value, right? And so this invitation to consider becoming a Haven partner is just that. It's an invitation to practically partnering with cultivating this community by committing some amount of resources every month to the project. I'm not pitching a certain amount to each of you, just like I'm not going to prescribe what dish you should bring to the potluck, okay? But I do encourage you to pray, you to seek the Spirit, you to allow Jesus to perhaps make you a bit uncomfortable, just as he did that brother in the streets or that house of the party he attended, that host, but help you determine what amount you might be called to bring each month. Maybe it's $5, maybe it's $500, maybe it's more. To those of you who are already doing that, we say thank you. This could be a good moment for you to check in with yourself and the divine. I think it's always good for us to kind of check in sometimes about what does partnership look like in the current season that we're in any of the things that we're a part of, right? But for others who, maybe haven't participated in this way, perhaps it's been, some of that trauma we've talked about in the past. Or something that's been sporadic, but not necessarily intentionally on an ongoing basis. What might that look like? Where might there be some redemptive freedom and growth in stepping into that new space of collaborative partnership? Yeah. Oh, I'm so sorry. So yeah, there's a question there. How is God inviting each of us to commit resources to our collective every month? And then the second question, who else? Who else might God invite to participate in our kingdom project? As part of this idea of Haven Partners is that, yes, we're a small crew here, but we also have friends, right? There are folks who used to be a part of Haven that maybe had to move across the country, but maybe they would still be interested in investing in what God is doing here. Or, parents or siblings, or who knows? Who knows? But what would it look like for us to think about that question out loud and to wonder, are there folks in our lives who maybe don't have a church like Haven, but believe that churches like this should exist and would like to participate in that way of helping make sure that it can exist and be sustained into the future? So that is that Haven Partners invitation. And certainly if you want to know more about practically what does that look like and how do you get started, Luca, myself, Brent, our treasurer, any of us would be happy to connect with you about that. But I want to end taking us back to reflection. Okay? We started with that moment of reflection about what makes us feel safe. And I want to end there too. Okay, we're going to return to that question. What is it that helps us feel safe and secure? And this time I'm going to invite you to invite the divine spirit into your reflection. Why don't you feel free to relax, take a deep breath, close your eyes if you like. I'm going to invite you to bring to mind maybe where you started, about what helps you feel safe and secure. To acknowledge that to God. And as you consider this afresh at the end of our conversation, as you also consider Jesus' assurance that you are like a raven or a lily that God cares to provide for, do you notice anything shift in what it feels like to experience safety and security? I encourage you to name whatever you notice internally to yourself and to the Holy Spirit. I also encourage you to wonder, to make space for Jesus to speak to you about if there are new ways that God is inviting you to find security and what that might look like. And finally, I invite you to hear this truth that you are held in the family of God. You are held by a divine parent who loves you. You are held in community with people who long to keep each other safe. What does it feel like in your body, in your spirit, to receive that you are held by God and you are held by others? God, may we carry that truth, those twin truths, that our safety and security ultimately resides in our sacredness. That all of us, all created in your image, are part of the divine family. That you care about us and you call us to care for one another and to receive the care of one another. May we feel our sense of safety and security grow when we are connected to those truths. And when we feel anxious about how that all gets supported, may we trust that we keep us safe. That as we lean into collaboration and solidarity, we will have everything we need. Amen. All right, friends. We're going to move into some conversation. So I've got a few prompts, where as always, feel free to chat about whatever feels relevant to you. We'll have 10 minutes. The first prompt is, who do you relate to in these passages we looked at today? Was it the brother frustrated about his inheritance, or the wealthy landowner, or the host of Jesus' dinner party, or Jesus himself? Anyone? And how? How did you feel connected to them? Or what experiences have you had of finding safety in solidarity? Or what do you think it might look like for you to divest from the economy of self-sufficiency and invest in this economy of God's kingdom? Any of those, or whatever feels live for you. Like I say, we'll talk about 10 minutes and then we'll come back for worship.